for the upcoming general election, and with it comes the possible return of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Reports claim Johnson is expected to campaign for the Conservative Party in the Midlands and Northern England before the general election. The UK Parliament constituencies of the Midlands and those constituencies in Northern England have historically held strong support for the opposition Labour Party. Political pundits have said the constituents have called the constituencies red wall seats, a reference to its left-of-centre policies. However, the Tories are seeking to woo back the voters who played a crucial role in Johnson's 80-seat majority in 2019. Johnson allies say the senior Tory figure is likely to visit marginal constituencies where he's expected to make speeches. However, while attributing to sources, British publication The Times said there's a very thin chance that Johnson is going to appear on stage with the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Since Johnson's exit from Number 10, the relationship between Johnson and Sunak nosedived, as Johnson has often accused Sunak of betrayal after his forced exit. However, it seems like both the leaders are trying to solve their differences. Recently, Sunak and Johnson issued a joint statement on the anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war. Recently, Sunak suffered a major blow after Lee Anderson defected to Reform UK. Anderson was a popular Red Wall Tory MP. Reports claim David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, who is now serving as the current Foreign Secretary, is also expected to throw his weight behind Sunak. On the contrary, Labour leader Keir Starmer has so far not sought support from former Labour PMs Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Labour members say Starmer will continue to fight the general election on his own terms. Well, for more on this, we're joined by our guest, Dr. Nigel Fletcher, a political analyst and commentator from London. Dr. Nigel, interesting news with Boris Johnson returning potentially to the political front line. Do you think that's likely to be a popular move with the electorate?
Well, it's quite difficult to see what the plan is going to be, because, as you mentioned in your introduction, it hasn't been the happiest of relationships between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. And I think it's interesting that in that report in The Times, they're very clear that it's highly unlikely that the two of them will appear together, which seems a little bit odd if you're having a general election campaign where Boris Johnson is supposed to be your secret weapon. The fact that he can't appear with the Prime Minister is a little bit peculiar. But it's quite clear to see why this would be attractive to the Conservatives. Boris Johnson did win that 80-seat majority at the last general election, and part of that was his appeal to those red wall seats, and it's those seats that are looking particularly precarious for the Conservatives. Although it has to be said, with a 20-point deficit in the opinion polls, quite a lot of seats outside of that area are also looking quite dangerous for them as well. But it's easy to see why the Conservatives would want Boris Johnson to do this, but it's less easy to see how that would coordinate with Rishi Sunak, given the history between the two men.
Yes, and I take your point there. As a man from one of those red wall seats that turned blue at the last election, the interesting point for me is that Johnson was indeed exceptionally popular in 2019. But since then, of course, we had the pandemic, we've had Partygate, and we've had the quite interesting, shall we say, prime ministerialship of Boris Johnson. I'm not sure the popularity in those red wall seats, from my experience, is still there. Do you think that he's still as popular in those areas?
Well, I think if you look at the opinion polling evidence, the answer would have to be no. He was a very popular Prime Minister for those seats, but it's one of these quirks of electoral politics that he had a unique appeal to a particular subset of voters, those who had voted Leave at the referendum in 2016, where, of course, Boris Johnson was a very prominent figure. And so when we got to the election in 2019, he had a particular appeal to them. But across the rest of the country, his popularity has never been that high and never been that great. And so since Partygate, since all of that controversy over his premiership, he is no longer the popular politician that he was. And actually in those seats, as you say, the red wall seats were seats which had traditionally voted Labour. They were looking for something different. They thought Boris Johnson might be that person. But a lot has happened since then. And I think the evidence shows that they lent their votes to the Conservatives but a lot of them remain to be convinced. And I think after the premiership that he had, it's certainly not clear that he would still have that appeal. But it is quite an attractive option, and I think it does show that the Conservatives are sort of casting around for anything that might help them at the next election. And I think that the sort of send for Boris kind of idea, which a lot of his supporters have been briefing for a long time, is one that I think eventually was going to come up. But I think, frankly, it's going to take a bit more than that to save them at the next election, given the state of the polls with Labour having a 20-point lead.
Yeah, one thing's for certain, I'm sure he's going to generate some headlines over the coming months. Dr. Nigel Fletcher, political analyst and commentator from London, many thanks for your insight.